Hi, everyone. Welcome to session one of the Ed Collab gathering. Kristen Zemke and Pernille Rip are going to be presenting on picture books, photos, and perspectives, visual literacy as a tool for fostering empathy. Kristen is a nationally recognized expert in technology integration and in particular has garnered acclaim for her work with early childhood classrooms. She engages students in authentic learning experiences where reading, thinking, collaboration, and inquiry are at the heart of the curriculum. Pernille is an expert in literacy and technology integration and dedicates her research and practice to developing engaged and empowered students and communities. In 2010, Pernille founded the Global Read Aloud, a global literacy initiative that began with the simple goal in mind of one book to connect the world. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to them.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Frances. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Ed Collab gathering. I'm Kristen, and I am thrilled to be here with you guys today. This is always one of my favorite days of the year as we get to connect online, spend some time together, and engage in, as Chris likes to say, PD in your pajamas. So Pernille and I are here with our coffee. Pernille, you want to say hello?
Good morning, everyone. Drinking tea in Madison, Wisconsin. Hope it's gorgeous where you are. So excited to be here with one of my favorite people in the whole wide world, Kristen. And I can tell you, you are in for a great treat as far as just some very practical ideas and things to think about for your own classroom, no matter the age you teach.
And I think that's where Pernille and I have a lot of common ground, is that we are both coming from a place of practical, right? Like, what are strategies and practices that you can try tomorrow with students, something that doesn't require a ton of setup, but really gets to the heart of what matters, and that's helping kids find their humanity in books, in online sources, and in conversations with each other in the world. And so with that, I think we're going to get started. Shall we, Pernille?
Sounds good.
Okay, let me flip it over here to our presentation. Excellent. And there we go. Great. So if you are following along online, please feel free to tweet us. Make sure to use the hashtag #TheEdCollabGathering. And if you want to throw a number 2 in there as well, we are session number 2 for the day. So that'll be just one way for us to track. Our handles are at the bottom of our slides. So please make sure to mention us as you go, and we'll try to get back with you at the end of our session answering some questions. So I think when we look at this piece of visual literacy and really start to think about the why, there are so many reasons for bringing visuals into our classroom. And whereas we know that kids need the visual images as a support feature, we also have a lot of standards that guide us and say, okay, you know, we're on the right track with this. This is an important piece of instruction. We want to see evidence of kids thinking along these lines. And so Pernille and I just pulled a couple of the different standards. You know, of course, we're looking at Common Core, but we're going beyond that. That's sort of the floor and not the ceiling of all that we want to incorporate. And taking a look at the C3 standards, the 21st century learning standards, the media literacy standards, and finding those places that say, yeah, you know what, this piece of visual literacy is important. Here is where kids will need to use it, and also why. And so I think looking at some of those pieces of understanding how and why media messages are created, being informed about art, visuals, illustration, and knowing those pieces can give more information and lead us to a little bit of the what's next in thinking. So feel free to spend some time with that, take a screenshot to come back to it later, and you know, find some of those evidence pieces for the why.
And then when we think about our own students as well, they are being bombarded with visual messages at all times. And so for them too, they need to be able to navigate all of the things that they are constantly infused in and also creating themselves. I think about my 7th graders, but even when I was teaching 4th and 5th, and how they were creating images and sharing them with others as a way to represent their thoughts. I mean, I think about my own kids, right? They come home and they tell me about their days, and sometimes there's a drawing attached to it. So this isn't just to cover the standards, but we always like to start with the standards to say there is actually a foundational need for this, but also to think about how are our own kids walking through all of this literacy or visual pieces that they are constantly having to not just take in, but also analyze and then somehow have a response to. And so we feel like it's our job as teachers to really make it a teaching point, and not just because pictures will engage kids or videos will engage kids, but because there's so much we can do that goes beyond just giving kids a text.
Absolutely. And piggybacking off that thought, what we would like you guys to do is just take a moment and visualize the last website that you viewed as a grown-up, right? Probably not your work email or your personal email, but as you were navigating online, what was that site? Take a moment and put it in your head. Think about what it looked like. How was content laid out on the page? What did you notice as you started interacting with that website? So take a moment, put that in your head. Chances are, as you viewed a website, that site opened with some type of image or video. And what we've seen over the last 6 or 7 years is that content laid out on web pages really leans to this visual piece. Now, in order to read a story, kids and adults have to click in order to get to that information. What we see on web page design is classic nonfiction features and purposes. Here's our image, there's a little caption below, and from that image or from that short video clip, we're making decisions about where we go and what we interact with. And so as I opened up just a couple of my favorite sites yesterday and took screenshots, you can see how that visual piece plays out on BBC, CNN, ESPN, and really be thinking about what we need to do to support kids to move forward.
And then also add to the conversation that often the image is what people remember more than what was said below the image. And so, for example, and we'll talk about this later on in more detail too, but I think back to when my students last year were doing a project on the Syrian refugee crisis, that depending on who was taking the picture, different stories were being told. And so it's interesting too for kids to go in and just look at, okay, if I'm only looking at the image, what can I get from it? But then if I read the text, does the image actually tell the full story, or does it just tell me that little angle that maybe they were going for? And so that's the other thing that we have to help kids navigate too, because how many of us just see an image, create our own story, and then go and share that with others, rather than actually figure out what's the story behind the story.
Absolutely, and I think that's human nature, right? Like your brain fills in the gaps. You make sense of whatever you're seeing in a story, but we do have to temper that with evidence, right? And I think in the last 2 years, we've had a lot of conversations about this in regards to social media. Where are you getting your story? How do you know? Is it accurate? Where did it come from? And so introducing those things in our classroom, I think, could be a really valuable piece. Going along with what Pernille said, like how do we know this information is actionable and valid, and where do we go as a next step with that? And I think regardless of the standards, we all have our scope and sequence and our district goals, but ultimately we're looking at the long form direction of students and getting back to what Pernille likes to say all the time is the most important standard of all, this piece of teaching kindness and engaging kids to really understand how someone feels, to build that empathy and to look at stories through multiple lenses in order to get there.
Yeah, because we start with kindness, just like we start with empathy, and then at some point that needs to translate into something. And so when we start with kindness and we start with understanding what other people are going through, then we can change that into action. And I think that's a message that you can promote and produce with any level of kids. In fact, I would say the older kids get the more we need to return to kind of the kindergarten lessons of how are you a good human being? Because it's really easy to get lost as you're developing your identity, especially once you hit those teen years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's an important piece. When we think about how we've addressed mini lessons in reading across the years, we've crafted and created countless mini lessons and then revised and refined them over time to really help kids comprehend a piece of text. We need to give the same energy and effort to our study of visuals as well. And just as we teach and refine our mini lessons in either reading or writing, we know that we can teach kids. We must give them time to practice a new skill or strategy, and then we look for kids to improve over time. One of the things I just read recently was talking about how as early as age 3, students are interpreting bias, and whether it be gender or culture or race. And so there's no time, I believe, that's too early to start teaching some of these things to kids and making them aware and giving them a name, and then using that awareness piece to build into understanding.
And I think that ties in with what Deb Reese was saying too in her opening today, right? Like there's no excuse to not do anything. There's no age group where this is too young for. We just craft our message to fit the level of kids that we're working with. And I think about that too as a mother of 4 white kids, right? Like, what is my responsibility to bring into my home to have conversations about, just like I hope that they're having in schools. So visual images become such a huge part of that, because that's how we craft those stories.
Absolutely. So let me go back and share really quickly here. Speaking of that piece of, what we need to be talking about, and that empathy and the why.
Yes. So when I was thinking about, why is this even more so such a cause that's close to my heart? And I think if we are to look around, for example, in the US right now, hate groups are on the rise. And it's interesting because if you look at the statistics for 2017, nationally known groups such as the KKK and the Nazis, their membership is actually on the decline. But that's because new groups are springing up in their place instead that are attracting new members. So it's kind of like people know that the KKK is inherently bad, but then they can go and join a different group that might share some of the same values, but is not branded the same way as the KKK. And so when I think about these messages that clearly are dominating our society in many ways, and coming up through our social media stream, how are kids navigating this? Because the thing is, it's really easy to think that hate groups and hate crimes and hatred in general towards others is happening outside of our community. But the thing is, it's happening within our own communities. We might just not be aware of it. And so when I think about what we can do in our classrooms, not to impose our own opinions on kids, but to just have them start making informed opinions about others, because that's really where empathy work lies. We are trying to not just know about others, we are trying to figure out why others who may not look like us or who may not share the same cultural values as us are just as important in this world as we are. And I think that that's a very important message to start with as kids grow up. And so I wanted to share that it's really scary to me that we live in a society right now where individuality is so important versus group values, that we are seeing this increase in hate crimes, because all of a sudden it's okay for me to share my opinion no matter what it is, as long as it's my opinion, nobody can say anything. And I think that's a conversation we need to have in our classrooms, because I also think, we're seeing more and more that people are getting their news sources from one source. And this is certainly also affecting our kids, right? Because they get their news and they get their opinions channeled down from their parents. So in our schools, we need to show different sides of the same stories. We need to show the different images. We need to show the different videos and give kids tools to navigate it all.
Absolutely. And I love what you said there, just about, being able to share your story, right? We're looking at, and I think a lot of people that I've come in contact with in the last couple of months have referred back to social media or information that's posted and shared online. And I know a lot of people right now are feeling like the train has left the station, you know, like we're so far away from where we are. How do we get back to having some of these conversations and really hearing? And I think in terms of digital learning and technology, it begs the question, have we taught kids how to use these as tools for empathy? You know, have we shown them where they can go online to hear someone else's story? Have we shown them how they can take action and take issues? So whereas it's a new tool, and we always see with new practices that pendulum shift, right? Of course, we can bring it back. And I think that piece happens in instruction. And so as we think about, you know, taking a look at images, this is such a valuable practice and something that years ago was much harder because we had to find images and actually get physical artifacts that we could investigate with students. Today, we can find images online. And one of the strategies that we use frequently is some type of image analysis. We have to teach kids how to think about these pieces and then give them lots of practice doing it. One of the strategies that I use, I've adapted from my mentor, Smokey Daniels, who does so much great work in really looking at multi-layered text sets and thinking about information in a variety of different ways. And he has a strategy called See, Think, Wonder. And it's almost like that graphic organizer in your mind that gives kids some structures for thinking. And when we give kids structure, just like why we run a workshop classroom, kids know what's coming next and know how to anticipate how they're going to interact with information, that they have a lot of free brain space to go deeply with information. And as the EdCollab gathering is contributing to a number of different hurricane relief sites this weekend, I thought it would be important for us to spend some time and look at some images reflecting the hurricane. And so I'm going to model for you what this might look like in our classrooms with the See, Think, Wonder. So here we go. When I look at this image, I think I just immediately see so much water, and it becomes very clear to me that this water is not in the right place, right? Like this isn't a lake, it isn't a river. But here we can clearly see what appears to be a family in a boat, and some people guiding them through the waters. And so I think my first question is, do these people know each other? Or are they all just literally in the same boat together trying to evacuate some of the floods? Where will they go next? What happened to their house? When I look at the woman's hand on that box, it makes me think like maybe this was the only box that she got to bring with her. The man on the right side with that headlamp, I'm wondering, is he a relief worker? Is he just a citizen who came to help? He's got a headlamp on, and so that makes me think he was doing the same type of recovery work as maybe it was dark out, right? And then I'm wondering, how long has this been going? As I look at this, I also see a group of people that possibly are from different places or different neighborhoods really coming together. We can see over in the distance people wearing some type of official looking neon jacket. And I'm wondering, okay, were the authorities able to get in and help this neighborhood? Or is this maybe something where people are just really getting together to help each other? And so I would model that piece and stop for kids and then say to students, okay, you know, you saw me think about this image. Why don't you have a go? As you take a look, what are some things that you might see, think, or wonder in this image, right? And I would invite kids then to apply the strategy in a different context. And so I'll let you just take a couple seconds to analyze that image, to go through it, to take a look. Use some of those thinking sims. What do you see? What do you think? What are you wondering?
And I think once kids have been established in this, they get really into it. And it also becomes something that they simply start doing. So the more we do it in our classroom, the more kids are like, oh, this is what I should do when I see an image. I shouldn't just consume it. I should actually sit and ask myself, what is this about? And then the wonderful thing is, then we can start to teach them, well, how do you pursue the questions that you're wondering about? And then that becomes that next level lesson of, how do we find out what the story is behind this image?
Absolutely. And so I think as we look at some of these pieces, we can find so much authentic teaching opportunities in the world, right? And bringing that into our classroom. So many spin-off lessons from this piece, whether it would be something along the lines of, you know, what does collaboration look like, sound like, right? How can you be a problem solver, create a workaround to a very real stressful situation? What do you notice about people coming together in a time of crisis? This is actually a group of people who obviously made a human chain to save an elderly man who was trapped in his vehicle as the floodwaters rose quickly. And so you can see the man on top opening the door and helping him get out, and then they passed him down the line to safety. And so I think really just a great example of people coming together regardless of economic background, city, you know, race, all of these things, because this is who we are and this is how we find our humanity. It could be verbal, turn and talk with a think partner. It could also be something a little bit more structured, where we invite kids to write on a chart or to fold a piece of paper in thirds and do some of that thinking. And so as we look at this information, I think then we are doing that raising awareness piece and start saying to kids, okay, where else do you see visuals in your life? What else might you be able to access a story in through an image or illustration?
And I think about, like, you know, like my own kids. So I have 4 kids, and they're between the ages of 3 and 8. And I think about the visual image that we even encounter when we're driving in the car, right? Like right now in Madison, we've seen a bigger homeless population surge because they don't have places to go. Our places to go are closing down. And so my kids have started picking up on these people holding signs at the side of roads, right? And of course, to them, they're like, what is this story here? And I think that that's so important. That's really what we're doing when we're bringing images into our classroom. It's almost like we're taking a snapshot of still life, right? And saying, okay, what's the situation here? Because we hope that kids won't encounter that situation. We hope no one will ever have to witness a human chain in a flooded area. But for them to go, wait a minute, what is happening here? And I think that that's so important, because sometimes I think when we get so focused on skills, we forget about the end game of school, right? The end game of school is to create better human beings that will not just be productive citizens, but actually create a better world. That's the hope we have for all of our kids. And so when we have these amazing see, think, wonder strategies in our classroom, that's what we want kids to then go out and apply to real life. And when they're meeting people too, right? What's the story behind this person who might not be a still life shot, but is now standing in front of me instead?
Absolutely. So let me flip back to our presentation here. Let's see. Lots of skills go along with this image study piece. Pernille, do you want to talk a little bit about inference?
Yes. Do we have the image?
Oh, sorry. It didn't
I'm
click
still
up.
looking at you.
Sorry.
So one of the things, and this is actually an idea that the amazing 8th grade teachers do in my school, and that I've used as well, is that we put up images without captions, without any stories. And so this image is one that I used last year, and I put it up and I simply said to my students, turn and talk, what can you infer? And kids started coming up with these theories of what they were looking at. And of course, a lot of them are saying, oh, it looks like garbage collected on a shore. Maybe there was a cleanup. Maybe there was a storm. And I just let their conversation run its course. I didn't give them any information. I did not set it up at all, because I wanted to hear what they could see. And also, one thing that I've learned and that I keep having to remind myself is, silence is good in a classroom, because it means that kids are thinking. And so we tend to jump in the minute we kind of get to the lull of the conversation. But I've learned with my 7th graders that typically that lull, if I just let it wait out a little bit, a kid is going to dig deeper, and that's going to inspire other kids to jump in with new theories. Now, you always have kids that kind of go, crazy theories, but it's interesting to see what they start to pick out on. So once the conversation is over and kids have presented their theories to the class of what they're actually seeing, that's when I tell them what this image is. And if you're not aware, or if you haven't figured out what this image is yet, these are refugees coming onto the island of Lesbos by Greece, and they are covered in the heat blankets. My kids' jaws just dropped. None of them had realized that these were human beings that they were looking at. And so that right away leads to a lot of questions, right? Why are they there? What's going on? Where are they getting these blankets from? Where do they go once they walk out of this image? And that's what I need to create in my classroom, kids that are curious, and especially curious about what happens to these human beings. And so I love using images that aren't always super easy to figure out what's going on, simply so that my kids can start to come up with their theories. And then sometimes they get it right, and other times they are so far off base, but this is what sticks in their mind. So looking for images that we see as we're kind of traveling social media and news to go, okay, would this be a good image to bring in without any kind of explanation or caption?
Absolutely. And I think just listening to you talk about that, I think awareness is so critically important, and just introducing this idea that we can find stories everywhere. I jumped up while you were like talking about that, Pernille, and started thinking about like an anchor chart, right? Like where can you see visuals in your life? And so the obvious pieces of like photos, right? Videos, graphics, but then are we teaching kids to like look at things like emoji? Right? Mm-hmm. Like, isn't that a way that we can tell story in images? That's something that even first graders are familiar with, and we can leverage. What about looking at things like memes, right? Like memes are a huge new way that we're telling stories with an image and short piece of text. Even things like virtual reality would be a place where we're looking at some type of visual and really looking for that deeper story piece. And so we need to make sure that we're teaching kids, how do you slow down? How do you notice and note what's in the foreground, what's in the background? What else might you see? Where can we go as a next step to find information?
And then don't feel like we have to come up with all the questions. And I think that's like Kristen just said that. What do you notice, right? That's the same thing with the See, Think, Wonder. Like, what do you see? What do you wonder? I think I spent much time at home planning all these very carefully guided questions where there really were just one answer. That's not what we want in our communities. We really want kids to elaborate and come up with crazy theories so that they can stretch that imagination, and also just those inference skills that they need to be critical thinkers. And so for me, it has actually given me more time when I bring in an image like that, because I'm not sitting and creating all of these questions.
Absolutely. And I think Steph Harvey always says, why is the teacher the only one that gets to ask questions? And that we need to shift our mindset on that. And what we find is that when we invite kids to share their ideas, they absolutely lean in to matters of significance. We don't have to get them there and hold their hand. Instead, students really need to be doing the work and that deep thinking piece. So as we talk about some of these things, right, we're seeing the power of graphics. And I think this idea of graphic literacy is so important. A new feature on the updated version of the SAT. So graphics have always been in the math section, but just last year they started to appear in the ELA section as well. Often misunderstood as easy to read because they're pictorial in nature, but actually highly complex pieces of text. Kids need time to practice reading these images and understanding them.
And they need time to go beyond the obvious, because I think often when we look at that infographic, right? Okay, what's this infographic about? My kids will say, oh, major hurricane risks. And then they'll kind of read off whatever it says. But we need to get beyond just the information presented. We need to say, okay, here are all the pieces. Now put it together and create the full story. And I think that that's what kids also need a lot of practice with. And I so agree with what Kristen said as far as we need to give them practice on this. The other thing that we need to be very aware of, and this is where we start kind of thinking about our own biases and the dispelling the one story. So of course, I'm referring to The Danger of a Single Story here, the amazing TED Talk. And if you haven't seen it, we highly recommend that you see it. But I think about when we teach about other cultures, and again, going back to Deb Reese's work, when we teach about Native Americans, what's the story that we're always teaching, right? I think about my own 4th grade textbook, social studies. Native Americans was something that happened in the past. It very rarely went into what Native Americans in America are now. And I think about that too when we bring in any kind of foreign cultures, so refugees or Africa. So I brought up these images because the image on the left is an image from an African tribe showing children. This is often what kids think of when we say Africa. But we forget that Africa is an entire continent, and not everyone lives in a tribe, in a mud hut somewhere. And so the image on the right is also an image of African children. And I think that that's what we need to make sure of when we are bringing images in, that we are not just bringing them in from one side of the story, and then that we're not perpetuating the one story. So when I did my refugee project last year, it was really important to us that, yes, I showed them images of refugees, such as the one that we showed with the Infer prompt, but also that we showed pictures taken by refugees, because the pictures taken by refugees was a completely different story that showed them actually smiling, right? And that's the thing too, we can have happiness in tragic situations. And so when we're teaching a book, for example, or when we're doing our favorite unit on Europe, which story are we sharing? Are we just sharing the dominant narrative, or the one that we already know? Or are we actually going out and saying, wait a minute, we can't actually make all of these insinuations about just one culture, one people?
Such great advice, and important in all that we do. So when we think about this piece, right, where can we find stories? We can find stories in art. Again, another type of visual that we can unpack and think about. One of my favorite sites is this little one, Wordless News, where the graphic artist creates a picture and then gives you a link to what's happening on the other side of that story. And so here we can see some of the flamingos that were evacuated from the zoo into the bathroom during the hurricane, right? We look for video, and there's many, many great videos out there. One of Pernille and my favorite sites is The Kids Should See This, a collection of videos that are absolutely appropriate for school, but not created by Annenberg or Reading Rainbow or something like that. But those short 2, 3, 4 minute videos that can really tell a different story or invite us to question a little deeper into a topic that we might not know a lot about. And then, of course, going back to, our favorite piece of picture books. What are the stories that can show a different perspective, help us refine and revise our identity, and really build some pieces of understanding?
And so one of the things we have to remember when we look at our library, our classroom libraries and our school library, is that all of those images are showing a story, right? So our kids are constantly bombarded by visual images from the moment they enter our schools, and they look at all of those pages and book covers. And so 3 questions that I think we need to use to critically evaluate our library collections are the ones on the screen here, not just who's being represented, but how are those characters represented? And that came from one of my students who asked me last year, one of my Black kids, and he said, Mrs. Ripp, why are all the kids, or the picture books featuring Black kids, always about slavery or civil rights? And I thought to myself, well, there's a huge book gap apparently that I have in my room that I was blind to, because here I was thinking like, oh, I have great great representation of people of color, and he's pointing out that the only times I'm showing them is either civil rights or slavery. And then also looking at who's not represented. I know that I have a major book gap when it comes to Native American literature, especially written by Native American authors. And that's also because we have a major problem in the publishing industry as far as these books not being published. And so using my own purchasing power to make sure that these rights are being wronged, and going out and searching out sources such as Deb Reese and other people, or Reading While White, or any of these that are highlighting books that we can bring into our classroom. And then making sure that we have own voices, authors represented. This movement came out of the We Need Diverse movements, and it really became a way to push marginally represented authors telling marginally represented stories. So do we have trans books written by trans authors? Do we have Native American books written by Native American authors, instead of people constantly, instead of it always being white authors? Because that's what happened a lot after We Need Diverse Books, was that a lot of white authors started using diverse characters. But that's not just what we need, right? We need people telling their own stories. And then which books are you highlighting and displaying? Because that's going to tell a story as well. I was asked in February what I planned on doing for Black History Month as far as my picture book display, and I said I'm not planning on doing one because my students have been seeing these books all along. And I think that's important. We don't just pull out our Hispanic picture book collection when we're celebrating Latina culture. You know, those need to be surrounding kids at all times, so that they're constantly seeing the myriad of people that surround us in our culture.
Absolutely. And I think when we really look at those titles, there are so many great options out there, but part of it is us being informed as educators and knowing where to go and to look. I love recommendations from Lee and Low as well. They do a great job of looking at the publishing industry and how do we get to those own voices pieces. Pernille, you had a couple of books that maybe you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, and it's always hard to pick because there's so many great books out there. So these are just a couple of recent favorites. Where Oliver Fits is Cale Atkinson's newest picture book, and it just talks about a puzzle piece who doesn't know where he fits, and so he's constantly trying to mold himself to fit the other puzzles until he realizes that he needs to be true to his own identity. That's a picture book that we can use with any age group, and I think about how many connections the kids will make, because when we're thinking about building empathy, tolerance, understanding, acceptance, and action, we need kids to understand where they fit in, and also how they try to change themselves to fit into different groups. Why Am I Me is one of the newer picture books, and it's getting a lot of buzz. It's an incredibly beautiful picture book that simply asks the question, why am I me, and where did I come from? And I think, again, when we start with anything with building empathy, kids need to have a full understanding of who they are. And I think about, and this is a conversation we've been having in my own school as we partner with the National Equity Project, is we're so used to thinking of white culture as just white culture. But then the minute we start thinking about anything that's outside of white culture, then we start thinking like, oh, well, they have all these traditions. And it's like that creates an otherness. And that, again, creates that white norm. And so Why Am I Me really starts thinking about, well, what is it that makes me me, and what is it that makes other people others? I just got Yo Soy Muslim, which is absolutely gorgeous because it isn't the dominant narrative that we're seeing about Muslims. And it's a father's letter to his daughter about why she should be proud of her heritage and who she is, and also the many facets of her identity. Because I think that's also, we've been really obsessed with in this culture of only labeling people with one identity. And the thing is that everybody has many, many different facets to who they are. And so Yo Soy Muslim does a really good job with that.
Awesome. A couple others that we were just going to mention. This new one, Come With Me by Hallie McGee, talks about what we see online or on television or in the media can sometimes be scary for young learners, and how can we become empowered to do something. And it goes back to this little act of having a voice as a child and taking action upon an issue. It's one of my favorites right now. One of my other favorites for this year is They All Saw a Cat by Brendan Wenzel, and really looking at how others, and a book about identity, how others see you and then how you see yourself, and leads to some great conversations, whether you're working in 1st grade or 7th grade, about how does the lenses that others put upon us color our view of who we are? How might we change that? How might that impact our perceptions? What do we need to notice about other people in order to have a great understanding of them? And so there's so many great titles out there. There's also a number of really fantastic websites that give us a place to access and start thinking about images in our classroom. Here we've listed a few of our favorites. One of my favorites is the picture prompts and what's going on in this picture from the New York Times. It's a fabulous, fabulous site that will guide kids through some of that thinking behind, you know, let's unpack an image. What do you think? What do you see? What do you think? What do you wonder? What is the text evidence that makes you say that? And so let me just open that up for you guys really quickly here and show you a little bit about what that looks like. So if you look at the picture prompts on the New York Times site, right, we can see all of these images that are gathered on a daily basis that invites kids to do some of this seeing, thinking, and wondering. If you look at their what's going on in this picture site, every Monday they post a provocative, you know, thoughtful image that invites kids to do some more thinking. And then as you scroll down below the image, it will invite kids, you know, what do you see? What do you think? What makes you say that in that image? And so Pernille and I will tweet out a number of these pieces later throughout the day. Ultimately, I think what we're looking at is to help kids not just tell their story with images and by creating them, but really to get a better sense of others, and then using that understanding and empathy that comes along with others to take action upon issues in the world, to advocate, to raise awareness, to possibly provide aid, and get to that empathy and humanity piece that we can find not just from books, but from images as well. And so we sort of just jotted down a quick list of questions that can help kids gain perspective and to think a little bit deeper about, I think this is, you know, a great place to start, and then turning it over to students to really see, okay, what are you thinking? What else do we need to investigate?
And I think the one that really stands out for me, right, is the bias piece, because I think kids have to remember that the camera is biased. That person taking that picture is taking it with a certain perspective in mind, and they're trying to find an image that illustrates whatever perspective they have of what's going on. And so I highly encourage people to investigate that with students, to really say, what's the story not being told here? And can you find an opposing image to this? Especially when it comes to things, for example, such as protest movements, right? Where's the image from the other side of the protest, for example, or where's the image from the other side of this whatever is going on, and so that kids can see, wow, there are different and competing stories at times being told.
And I think we found ourselves again in this place where loud voices are getting a lot of attention. And so seeking out the space to hear those other side of the stories and thinking about what we can do with images to invite kids into that work is exciting and provides us an opportunity. You know, we're at this place of possible, I think. And in closing, I love Cheryl Strayed's work, and from Brave Enough, you know, she had this idea that when we look at story, whether it be written or for our purposes today in a more visual format, it's really helping us, you know, look at our thoughts, create that counter narrative, and start from a place of possible where not only do we empower kids, but we empower each other to hear what's happening in the world. And then hopefully hearing will inspire us to do something about what's happening in the world. And so I think as we have just a couple more minutes, Pernille, final thoughts.
Just that this work is so important and it's not hard. I mean, I think anytime we think of something new, we're like, oh, one more thing to add on. But I think about some of the things that this is more valuable than just teaching a summary, right? I mean, you can give an image and then all the things that you can do with that image, from inferring to analyzing to pointing out evidence to starting discussions. And yes, certainly they can summarize what the story is behind it. And so really think about, where are the images and am I bringing them in purposefully in my classroom, can really inspire also more student talk, which is one of my favorite things to hear in classrooms, right? We need kids talking more, and images are a natural invitation into conversation.
And I love what Pernille said. You know, it doesn't have to be like a huge unit of study, right? It doesn't have to be a 30-minute on the rug mini lesson. It's that quick invitation to access through a visual format, and then to be more responsive as we see those visuals in everything that we encounter. It has been a treat, I think, to be here with you guys today. As we head out, and if you're looking for more information on any of this stuff, Pernille and I both have a couple of books that we could share with you. So please feel free to check those out at any point in time. And also know that we're both very responsive online. So reach out via Twitter, via Facebook, check out our websites if you have questions, and we'd be happy to help you continue to think about this with your students.
Absolutely. So thank you for spending your time with us today, or later if you're watching the recording, and reach out, because we're all in this together, all trying to create more kind human beings. So take care.
Thanks everybody for your energy for this work. Have a great week.
Thank you so much, Kristen and Pernille. That was fantastic. It went by far too fast. There are so many great suggestions for talking with kids of any age, empowering all kids to have that voice and use it to take action and be active in their community and just a worldwide citizen. Thank you so much. Before we sign off, I just want to share the upcoming sessions. Session 2 will include lots of exciting talks. Jillian Heiss and Teresa Bunner will be presenting on I'm White, So Now What? And it focuses on making a place for conversations around race in schools. Maggie Roberts will be presenting on being your favorite teacher and exploring the art of great teaching. Stephanie, Heidi, Kathleen, and Suzanne will be presenting on building a virtual learning network for professional learning. And after session 2, there's even more great sessions to come, so please stay on, or if you're watching later, continue to watch and check them out. Thanks so much, everyone.